Manchester in the early 19th century was not a city you admired from a distance. It was a city you felt immediately, in the air, in the noise, in the constant motion that never seemed to slow. Unlike older cities shaped by courts, cathedrals, or ancient power, Manchester rose for a different reason. It did not grow because it was chosen, it grew because it worked. And by the 1800s, that work had begun to change everything. At the start of the century, Manchester was already expanding beyond recognition. What had once been a modest market town had become something denser, louder, and more urgent. Streets filled quickly, buildings climbed upward. Smoke settled into the sky and stayed there. The city no longer slept the way others did. People arrived constantly. Families from nearby villages, workers from across England, migrants from Ireland, drawn by the promise of wages, however small. They came because Manchester offered something rare in its time: regular work, not stability, not comfort, just work. That was enough. The heart of this transformation was cotton. Raw cotton arrived from across the Atlantic, fed by global trade networks that stretched from the American South to the ports of Liverpool. From there, it moved inland to Manchester, where it was spun, woven, dyed, and packed again for export. The city became a node in a system far larger than itself. Factories reshaped the landscape. Early mills rose along canals and rivers, built to harness water power before steam engines took over. Brick walls, tall windows, long interiors filled with machinery. Inside, the sound was overwhelming. Metal frames rattled, belts turned endlessly. The rhythm of production never paused. Work days were long, often 14 hours or more. Men, women, and children worked side by side, each assigned a task small enough to be repeated thousands of times. Skill mattered, but endurance mattered more. The machines did not slow down, neither could the people who fed them. Outside the mills, the city adjusted around this new reality. Housing appeared wherever space allowed. Rows of narrow houses were built quickly, often cheaply, packed tightly together. Streets were uneven, drainage was poor. Entire neighborhoods formed almost overnight, without planning or foresight. Manchester did not grow carefully, it grew urgently. Canals cut through the city, carrying coal, raw materials, and finished goods. Later, railways followed, reinforcing Manchester's role as a center of movement and exchange. Everything flowed through the city: goods, people, capital, information. It was a place constantly in transit, even for those who never left. Yet, for all its productivity, life here was harsh. Overcrowding brought disease. Cholera outbreaks swept through working-class districts. Water sources were contaminated. Waste piled up faster than it could be removed. Smoke darkened buildings and lungs alike. The city's success carried a cost that was impossible to ignore. And still people stayed. For many, Manchester represented a gamble. Conditions were brutal, but wages, however low, offered possibilities unavailable elsewhere. A family might survive. A child might learn a trade. A worker might save enough to move. Someday, somewhere better. Hope was fragile, but it existed. At the same time, Manchester was not only a city of labor, it was also a city of ideas. The scale of industrialization forced people to think differently about society itself. Questions of rights, wages, housing, and representation could not be avoided when so many lives were bound together so tightly. Political movements took root here. Trade unions began to organize. Reformers gathered. Protest meetings filled public spaces. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819, where peaceful demonstrators were violently dispersed, became a defining moment not only for Manchester, but for Britain as a whole. The city learned that industrial power did not automatically bring political voice. Education followed industry. Mechanics institutes, libraries, and lecture halls appeared, driven by the belief that knowledge mattered in a mechanized world. Manchester became a place where workers read, debated, and questioned the system that relied on them so heavily. Religion also adapted. Churches multiplied, attempting to serve expanding populations. Some offered comfort, others offered discipline. Faith remained present, but it competed with exhaustion and survival. As the century progressed, Manchester grew more complex. Wealth accumulated at the top. Industrialists built large homes away from the densest districts, often on higher ground where the air was cleaner. Meanwhile, workers remained concentrated near factories, bound by distance and necessity. The contrast was stark. Prosperity and poverty existed within walking distance of each other. This imbalance shaped the city's character. Manchester did not hide its contradictions. They were visible everywhere. By the mid-1800s, the city had become a symbol. To some, it represented progress, innovation, and modernity. To others, it was a warning, a demonstration of what unchecked industrial growth could produce. Writers, economists, and observers came to study it. Manchester was no longer just a place, it was a case study. And yet, daily life continued. Children walked to mills before sunrise. Workers returned home after dark. Markets still operated. Music was played. Relationships formed. Ordinary moments persisted inside an extraordinary system. The city did not pause to reflect on itself. It kept moving forward. Technological change accelerated. Steam power replaced water. Machines grew faster and more precise. Output increased. So did pressure. Manchester's identity became inseparable from production. Even its skyline reflected it, chimneys rising where church towers once dominated. By the late 19th century, reforms slowly improved conditions. Working hours were reduced, child labor laws were introduced, sanitation systems improved. These changes came gradually, often after resistance. Progress was not gifted, it was argued for. Manchester did not soften overnight, but it learned. As the century closed, the city stood transformed. It was no longer experimental, it was established. Its systems, for better or worse, had proven themselves. Manchester had helped define what an industrial city could be. When we look back today, it is tempting to summarize this period in statistics, output figures, population growth, trade volumes. But those numbers miss something essential. They do not capture the lived experience of a city constantly adjusting to forces larger than itself. They do not capture the sound of machines echoing through narrow streets, the smell of coal and oil, the fatigue carried home each night, the sense that the world was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. That is where modern AI reconstruction comes in. Using historical maps, factory records, photographs, and written accounts, we can attempt to step back into 19th century Manchester, not as a symbol, but as a place, to move through its streets, to see how close people lived to where they worked, to understand how space, labor, and time were reorganized. These reconstructions do not romanticize the past. They do not erase hardship. They offer perspective. They allow us to see how systems were built from countless individual decisions, compromises, and constraints. Walking through Manchester today, much has changed. The mills are silent. The canals are calm. Smoke no longer defines the sky, but the structure remains. Streets follow industrial logic. Neighborhoods still reflect patterns set 2 centuries ago. The city remembers, even when it looks different. Sometimes I imagine standing on a Manchester street in the early 1800s, watching workers pour out of a mill at the end of a shift. Faces tired, hands stained, conversations brief. A city aware, perhaps, that it was becoming something new, but unsure what that would mean. Manchester was not born industrial. It became industrial. And in doing so, it reshaped not only itself, but the modern world that followed. For now, AI reconstructions are one of the closest ways we can revisit that transformation. They help us move through a city that once defined an era not as a monument, but as a lived environment, shaped by necessity, ambition, and human effort. If there's another city, another period, or another turning point you'd like to explore, let me know. Cities change, but their stories remain with us. If this journey into the past is meaningful to you, liking the video and subscribing would be a huge help in keeping this work going.